This note set is to present the major groups of brachiopods that most people are ever going to see in their collecting, and also give you an idea of their biostratigraphic breakdown by these major groups. A couple of sections in the book that are particularly important: the ecology section and the biogeography section. Collectively, it's just less than 4 pages. I recommend you look at that. Now, when I go over these different groups, I'm going to use the terms that we talked about, that I presented to you when we first talked about brachiopods. So I'm just going to rattle these things off, and there they are, but you're going to have to remember these when you're identifying specimens or describing them, say, on an exam. So first group is the order Orthida, the orthids we call them. And as it says there, they are mostly strophic. There are a few astrophic ones. It's never huge hinge lines, but there they are. Biconvex shells, there's usually the strong radial ornament that you see in the figure right there. Very small little interareas. And these are among the very first of the articulated brachiopods in the base of the Cambrian, and they linger all the way to the top of the Permian. The pentamerids, they're a unique group. They are usually preserved or seen as big internal molds. It's probably some unusual factor about their shell microstructure, but we're not going to get into that in a big way. Typically, they are strophic or astrophic. Again, you're not going to see that with most of them that are preserved, but they do have a strongly biconvex outline and a huge incurved beak. That's this pointy area that my cursor is going over here. Spoon-shaped structure, that's the extension of this. So you'll look on the internal mold that you'll get, and you'll see a nice distinct line. It'll look like a little crevasse. Now think about that. If the shell was actually there, that'd be a little septum or wall of the shell dividing one half from the other half. But it sort of extends down, and then it opens up into like a little spoon structure. Again, all you're going to see is a internal mold with a little crevasse here. And these things are particularly distinctive of the Silurian. And so in particular for us here in Wisconsin, if you go up to Door County, you can find a lot of these things in little road cuts and things like that. A big group now, the order Strophomenida and the suborder Strophomenidina. These are very distinctly strophic. Look at that big wide hinge line there, very wide. They have a plano-convex to concavo-convex outline, meaning that there's usually one flat shell, one scoop-shaped shell, or basically two shells spooning each other. Strong radial ornament as shown here, and as it says, they come along in the Ordovician, very abundant in the rocks that we have around here in southeastern Wisconsin, and they linger all the way to the Triassic, so they somehow eke through the end of the Permian mass extinction. Another order, the Productids, a very strongly concavo-convex type of brachiopod, and they have spines, hollow spines all over their body. Now you don't see them here in these figures, but you see like these little pimples or bumps on there. That would be the base of the spine, and the spines would radiate out from these things. So when you have perfectly, pristinely preserved specimens, you'll have the spines, but usually you will just have these little bumps like this. They come along in the Devonian, they become very abundant in the Carboniferous, and they're dominant in the Permian. If you have Permian rocks, you're going to have producted brachiopods. Also within the order Strophomenida, there is the suborder Conitida, again another strophic group, plano-convex to concavo-convex again. They do have spines, but they're only located along this posterior margin on the hinge line, and they kind of point out like this. They are typically not there either, so if you ran your fingernail or the tip of a pencil over this, you'd feel bump, 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 bump. There they are. Small inner areas. Ordovician to Permian, again, dominant in the Carboniferous and Permian. These things might have been active swimmers. So they're typically called not just benthic creatures like all other brachiopods. Sometimes we call them nectobenthic. The thought is that maybe they clapped their shells together like scallops. The scalloped bivalves swim. Then a real weird group in the Strophomenids, the suborder Oldhaminidae, and they look like a preserved, it looks like a rib cage, doesn't it? The ventral valve, the pedicle valve, is very, very deep and scooped, and then it has this kind of weird, this rib cage you see is the upper valve, the dorsal valve sitting on it. They grew in reefy type environments, and it's thought that they might have had symbiotic algae. They are an exclusive Permian group, and I think you'll get the chance to see one of them in the lab, maybe. Then we have the order Spiriferidae, again a strophic shell, a big wide hinge line, very biconvex. Inside, and we'll have a picture in just a second, they built a lophophore support that's sort of spiral like a slinky that holds the lophophore up, and that sometimes gets preserved. Huge, huge inter areas, these big flat areas here that presumably acted to stabilize them flatly on the substrate. Strong, very strong radial ornament, and as you see here, they were around from the Silurian into the Jurassic, so they managed to eke through, again, the Permian-Triassic mass extinction. Here's a picture of one of these shells sort of sawn in half. You can see it's still filled with mud, but you can see this sort of outline that looks like a bunch of little bullet holes here and here. That is where the saw blade has cut through that spiral lophophore support. So it was preserved in there. The order Rhynchonellidae, these are very astrophic shells. They are hinged together at a point, very biconvex, again, a strong radial ornament. This is the first group I'm going to point out that has a strong fold and sulcus. We talked about that. And then a Deltherium, typically there, if you see the pedicle opening, it's going to be a little triangle. They also had a spiral lophophore support, but boy, it's really, really hard to find specimens where you can actually see that. They've been around very, very long time, from the Ordovician all the way to today. There's still a few Rhynchonellids that live today, not very many though. And then the last major group, the order Terebratulidae, again another astrophic group. They are hinged at a point right about here below this pedicle opening. Biconvex, you can see the sort of bean type shape. Instead of having a spiral lophophore support, they have a very detailed loop that they make in there. Again, it's so fragile, usually it's broken, you'll never see it. And when I say punctate, I mean that their shell typically has thousands of teeny tiny little pores over it that allows gas exchange in and out. Again, from the Devonian to the recent, and they are the dominant group of the recent. Talking about that then, we can say that you can look at the different geologic periods and say what the brachiopods would be as dominant organisms during each of those periods. And if you just randomly collect rocks somewhere, and say you collect 100 brachiopods somewhere, you're bound to get these results. So in the Cambrian, we have mostly the inarticulated types. Remember the Craniiformia and the Linguliformia, but a few simple orthids would be there. Then those mostly go extinct, and we get to the Ordovician, where we're dominated by orthids and then strophominids. In the Silurian, you have the strophominids and pentamerids. And then in the Devonian, you get a whole mix of things then. Remember, the Devonian has been known as the age of brachiopods. There are lots of astrophic spirifers, interestingly enough. Some strophic ones. Strophominids, Rhynchonellids, Terebratulids. The Devonian's an interesting transitional time. And then the Upper Paleozoic, the Carboniferous. You get lots of what we consider true spirifers, the spirifers that you're going to see most in labs or anywhere you collect, but also productids and conetids. And then, as I mentioned before, in the Permian, productids dominate. There's also conetids, very large spirifers, old hominids. There you go. That's the Cambrian through the Permian, the Paleozoic. After the Permian-Triassic boundary, brachiopods suffer a huge mass extinction. They barely eke through, and bivalves become the dominant bivalve creature ever after. So that when you're looking at Mesozoic faunas, early on you'll have a few spirifers and strophominids, but then it slowly but surely gets, there's a transition to mostly rhynchonellids and really pterobrachioids. And from the Jurassic to today, pterobrachioids are the dominant group, and rhynchonellids are very minor. And so, for instance, the brachiopod that you were looking at the size data of, Waconella wacoensis, it's from the Cretaceous, and it's very definitely a pterobrachioid. Those are the major brachiopod groups.